It's Cape Ann Report, and I'm your host, Maureen Aylward. Our topic is Community Roundtable, where my guests will discuss important issues to them and also related to the community. My guests include Paul Lundberg, current City Council President and Gloucester City Councillor at Large, Catherine Schlichte, attorney at Schlichte and Johnstone, PC, and Peter Dolan, Community Citizen, Gloucester Citizen.
Citizen of Gloucester.
Thank you so much for joining me at our first Community Roundtable.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Thanks for inviting us, Maureen.
It's going to be a wonderful conversation, I think. So for our viewers, what we're aiming for is each one of you will put forth a community issue that's important to you, and then all of you will discuss it, and then we'll move to the next one. So, Paul, you're sitting right next to me.
Great.
You're first.
Well, I will start with a subject that's been very front and center in Gloucester, and it's true in all communities in Cape Ann, but in Gloucester in particular, because it's affordable housing. And we just approved in our city the Fuller mixed-use venture, which is going to replace what's the abandoned Fuller School with a development that includes the YMCA, but it includes 200 units of housing, 30 of which will be affordable. And the affordable housing is a very important piece, both from a state and local legal standpoint, but also a community philosophy standpoint. And we are very excited to have such a big addition of affordable housing in Gloucester.
That's fantastic. So opening it up to all of you, can we define affordable housing, and what do you think?
Well, I think there's two types of affordable housing, really. There's subsidized housing, which is sort of the housing that's run by the Gloucester Housing Authority, and it might be rental certificates, or it might be housing developments such as that on Maplewood Avenue. And then there's affordable housing, which is a lot of private housing agencies like Harbor Light Community Partners or Action Inc. will own and operate housing that is affordable based on a working family's income. They set the rental rates based upon the income that family or individual household will be making, and then make that rent to be affordable to the individual. Because we have a real affordability problem in Gloucester. We have 40% of the households in Gloucester pay more than 30% of their income in housing. Of that 40%, about 20% of them are paying 50% of their income in housing. And of that entire 40% group, half of them are seniors over the age of 62. So it's really an issue that we need to keep our eye on and try to keep producing affordable housing that meets the needs of our residents.
And what do people think is a more reasonable amount to be spending for your shelter out of your income? 25%?
Well, certainly not 30%, because that has societal cost to it. I mean, if you're spending 30% of your income on housing, that puts you at a crunch for medical expenses, for home repairs, for food, for extracurricular activities for your children. So I think that the HUD has sort of determined that 25% really would be like a maximum that you might want to spend on your housing, so that you have, income left for other essential needs.
Right. So, Paul.
And yes, and so the community goal of affordable housing really is to provide sufficient housing at a affordable price for working families. And this is, when I say working families, there's a lot of technical definitions. My definition is two breadwinners in the family, two spouses who are both working to raise their families, and that's what this is all about. So when you look at incomes and the kind of incomes people can earn, who we want to be able to live in the community in which they work, that's a very important aspect. So right, teachers and firefighters and policemen and people who work on the production line at Gorton's and so forth, those people, we would like to be able to have housing that they can afford right here in Gloucester.
Right. And people who have lived here for a long time, the elders, it's impacting elders, right? So
definitely. I mean, we are very fortunate in that Our planning department has produced a housing production plan.
The City of Gloucester.
The City of Gloucester, has produced a housing production plan, which looks at housing needs overall. I mean, we need housing in every category: single-family homes, multifamily homes, market rate homes, and affordability. But they spend a particular amount of time looking at affordability and steps that we can take to try to increase the amount of affordable housing or multifamily housing that we have. I think one of the things that they look at is, in particular, we need to look at our downtown area as a area that is primed to be able to receive 300 to 500 more multifamily units right in the downtown area, which particularly is important for affordability in that you have a lot of amenities nearby.
Right.
Walkability. There's walkability. Yeah. Plus, it also creates, let's not forget our young people, because we have an aging population in Gloucester. Yeah. By 2030, I think it's 58% of the population is going to be 62 and older, and that has an economic impact on us. We want to be able to draw young people who are going to be an economic force for us and whatnot. Right. They like small units, downtown walkability. So
that's all changing.
It's an important issue.
So when you say it's a housing production plan, you don't mean it's not just a plan to build more housing and develop areas maybe that aren't developed. It's also about maybe changing the nature of existing housing stock.
Well, it is like a widespread plan. It does particularly talk about the need to create and produce more housing. Yes, building more housing. I think it said by, 2018, we needed 483 units of multifamily housing. And I think between 2010 and 2018, we probably got about 400 of those, right? 200 of them being the fuller units. But it also looks at the need to maintain existing housing. We have grant programs that help rehabilitate and help people stay in their existing affordable homes that might be in need of repair. We have, first-time home buyer programs that help people get into homes that are already existing. Yeah. So there's kind of a multifaceted approach to it, but it does have a big focus on producing and creating more units in the city.
How can people also find more information about what's available and how can they learn more about?
So the city's website is getting more and more robust, and people go to the city's website and you'll see the various departments under community development. You can click on there, and there are several of the city's strategic plans for housing and economic development. The housing production plan is one of several. One thing that Catherine mentioned that I'd just like to highlight is in terms of the location of housing is this mobility issue. Mobility is very important. We are always looking to enhance our public transportation and locating housing where people can rely on public transportation is also very important. As a city, we're not housing developers, but we do facilitate those kind of plans that are going to work together. So housing, transportation work together.
Great. Well, I'd like to switch the topic now. Peter, throw out your topic.
Well, one thing that I thought was worth talking about this week was, I think a lot of people saw this. There was a headline in the paper earlier this week.
The Gloucester Daily Times.
The Gloucester Daily Times that said the lottery's sending a windfall to the cities and towns. And I got curious and I wondered, is this, for a lot of different reasons, is this money that was announced on Tuesday really a windfall to the city? And I think Paul had a good point about this, that we've actually known that some of this money was coming for a while. We were talking about this in the green room before we came onto the set, right, Paul?
Yes.
We knew this money was coming.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. But it's worthy to note that our share of the lottery, Gloucester's share of the lottery proceeds is over $4 million that we get from the state this particular year. So it's somewhere in that neighborhood we've gotten for a couple of years.
So is each city and town's share of the lottery proceeds based on what they spend on the lottery, or what they have for sales on lottery tickets, or is it just based on
My understanding
population?
Is that it's not that simple. It's not directly correlated that way, that there's a formula that takes into account property values in the city, that the money goes from you buy a ticket and the money goes into a pool of money, and about a little under 3/4 of that money is paid back in prizes to the lottery winners, and that about 20% of that money actually comes back to the cities and towns in the form of local aid. And the remainder of the money is used to actually run the program, to pay the people who sell the tickets and the people who manage the lottery system. But about 20% of the money that's raised through lottery ticket sales comes back to the cities and towns. But the state has a formula for doing that. I don't know if it takes into account income. It doesn't directly take into account how many tickets were purchased. And I think that's something that I always think about when we talk about the lottery, is that, one way to look at it, and it's not the only way to look at it, is that it is a way of taxing the people in the cities and towns. It's the state takes the money from us, and then the state redistributes it somehow. And I think it's important to realize that we spend, and you can find this information out if you call up the lottery office, they'll tell you we spent about $24 million last year on the lottery, so we're getting back somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of that. But it's a big expense for the city, and I think if Paul and his colleagues on the city council announced that they were going to be instituting a new tax that was going to take $24 million out of the city, we'd have our pitchforks out and our torches, and we'd be marching up to City Hall to talk about it.
The thing about the lottery is if you're looking at it as a tax, it's a voluntary tax. In other words, those people who participate in the lottery do so voluntarily. Right. And, I guess that's kind of that is a windfall right there, because it's just money that wouldn't come from anywhere else. So.
Right. But there's a consequence, obviously, in the city. If residents are paying $24 million into, or people who come here to visit and they're purchasing lottery tickets, there's a consequence to that.
They're not purchasing something else.
They're not purchasing something else, but also by participating in the lottery, it's a form of gambling. And
right, I seem to recall that there, was a promise initially when the lottery went into place that those return funds would go towards education or gambling addiction clinics that might help people who have a problem, or to address maybe some of the negative impacts of the lottery. But I suppose $4 million is to our general fund is nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah, and it may make, in the overall picture, we tax people's property, we have meal taxes and sales taxes, and it may make sense in the overall picture. I just think sometimes we lose sight of that we think, this is a windfall to the city, we just got $4 million. Well, we also spent somewhere over $20 million to make this $4 million come back to us, and how that money got distributed is something we should be thinking about in the bigger picture.
Yeah, these kinds of things that come up and they're just restructured in a way of thinking of it, it's so important to consider the money that's coming in, the money that's going out. Paul, did you want to say something?
Well, I'm just, thinking about the various sources of income that we have to run the city, and property tax is the largest, but these other sources are really important. And the lottery, which before it existed, that money just wasn't there.
Didn't exist at all.
So it has been a very big benefit to cities and towns because they didn't have it before the lottery was existing.
So I guess that there's no mechanism or consideration in place to take some of those funds that come in from the lottery and put it towards these gambling addiction programs in Gloucester. Would the city even consider something like that?
Those programs, like any other public health program, are part of what our public health department does in terms of concocting what they have as their strategic plan and what are the issues that they think are most important in the city to address. And gambling addiction has not been one of them. It could be if they perceived it to be a real public health issue. I think the bigger issue they're going to have is education on the fact that we now have legalized marijuana in the Commonwealth, and that's going to be an educational thing that the Department of Health is going to want to get into.
Yeah, there are always two pieces to these issues. There's the issue of do we do this in the first place? Are we comfortable? I mean, there was a time when there wasn't a lottery in Massachusetts, or where marijuana sale wasn't legal and wasn't going to be taxed, and we make a decision that we're going to do these things, and then we also can think at the same time about how are we going to spread that money around? How are we going to redistribute this? This money, like for the lottery, comes in a certain way, and it's the state has a way of doling it out to the cities and towns. The marijuana sales is another one that's going to be taxed, and some of that money will come back to the city.
Correct.
Yeah, Paul, can you update us while we're on this issue of retail marijuana sales, recreational marijuana? Just briefly to touch on this,
Yes,
because it is a community issue.
Right, and so the voters in the Commonwealth approved the use of marijuana recreationally 2 years ago. This is a program run by the state. The license to sell marijuana will be state licenses. The state left it to the cities and towns to zone for where the shops will be located. That is a precedent. That's a precedent to anyone getting a license to sell marijuana. In the city of Gloucester, we have now just passed the zoning for that, so we've got that piece in place, and once that will take effect within 30 days, and then applicants who wish to open stores in Gloucester will be able to apply to the state for a license. So we're there now.
And will the revenue for that the city receives from that be up to the city to spend?
Well, yes.
Or is it restricted in certain ways?
So the state will charge a 17% sales tax on retail recreational marijuana, and the cities will get back 3% of that.
And the other 14% goes to the state?
The state. Yeah.
And some of that will maybe eventually find its way.
Just like the lottery, right?
Well,
how is it?
Exactly.
How is it going to find its way back to Gloucester?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that 3% into the general fund, no specific
earmark except to the fact to recognize that we will have costs for oversight, law enforcement, health oversight, and so forth will be city costs. We don't know what those really are. We have some estimates. We don't know what the revenues really are going to be. We have some estimates, but
is that similar to how, say, liquor is taxed?
Yes.
The tax, it's a very similar
pretty much
structure.
the same.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, new times ahead.
Yeah,
No, absolutely.
Catherine, what topic are you bringing to the table?
Well, I think with this year's weather events in Puerto Rico and Houston, and now most recently in the Carolinas, I have been thinking about our coastal resiliency. And we know ourselves what happened, I think it was in March, when we had these tidal surges and we saw all of Roger Street underwater, and a lot of neighborhoods were flooded. It got me thinking about, well, what is Gloucester doing to prepare for these rising sea levels and to make our coast more resilient? And I took a look at Gloucester just, I think in April, the city of Gloucester, through its planning department, hosted a coastal vulnerability workshop and tried to identify a bunch of vulnerabilities that we've had. But I guess the question is, what now? Where do we go from here? They've identified some critical infrastructure, like our water treatment plant on Essex Avenue. Some of our roadways, the causeway or roadways out of Gloucester. Some of our neighborhoods have some serious flooding issues, particularly Lanesville or Riverdale or, the back shore. They also identified some strengths that we have. We have a local hospital. We have a professional fire department. I thought it was interesting that they noted we have some grocery stores on high ground. We have a good water supply. We have a ham radio community. We have an emergency communication.
Those were all
but
important.
At this point, what are we doing for?
It's a little scary to think that we're thinking that we might need these things.
Yeah, I think that
somebody's building a house near me, and it's up on concrete stilts.
Yes.
And I met the homeowner one day when I was out walking my dog, and he said to me, "Doesn't look so funny now, does it? After the winter."
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And also seeing what places like the Carolinas are going through right now. I mean, who would have thought that they would have experienced such a strong storm? But and inland too, which we saw that a few years ago in Vermont with Hurricane Irene, in inland hurricane.
Oh yes.
So
Right, yeah, Vermont was devastated.
Vermont was
I
devastated.
remember
and
driving up there
yeah.
not long after.
The Carolinas are going through both a coastal storm and an inland storm with flooding. So what can we expect for Gloucester? We've seen the future. It's here.
Right. So I think there's like two components, right? There's like the emergency response to the immediate threat, but how do we make ourselves less vulnerable? And I think, like with housing, I think with coastal resiliency, we need to look to zoning and start to, do we increase the building height so people can build higher?
Mm-hmm.
Do we, do zoning so that we are encouraging people not to build in vulnerable areas or to build back from our, marsh and barrier beaches? I think that what was made clear about this workshop is that we need to do a lot more planning and studying.
Yeah, maybe we're a little bit behind.
It feels like we're behind, I think.
So
people don't want to be told they can't build a house somewhere.
Right.
But at the same time, then they turn around and there is a societal cost. Because they expect help rebuilding or...
Yeah, I think I read a statistic...
Or to be saved in the middle
to be
of the
rescued
storm.
if they need to be. Yeah.
I think I read a statistic that Massachusetts is one of 10 states in which they have a 70% rebuild. We keep letting these buildings be knocked down and rebuild again. Yes. Well, it seems to be that we need to have maybe a little more forward thinking about even the rebuild. If you're going to build it up, build it.
Yeah. So, Paul, what do you think about this issue?
Yeah. So right now there are federal requirements about the rebuild that the living space must be a certain number of feet over the 100-year high tide, and if you're in the velocity zone, which is the part of the coast where that becomes inundated with a wind event, there's other requirements like that. Then you layer on that that is now layered on top of our zoning requirements for building heights and so forth and setbacks, which we have not yet addressed. I think as Catherine points out, that's the kind of thing we should be starting to think about now.
Yeah.
Yeah, Peter?
Oh, no, I didn't have anything else.
You didn't have anything else to add to that one? It's such a critical issue. We're a coastal community, and sea level rise is going to impact us here, even in the north shore of Massachusetts, where we're a little bit different than the Cape.
Right.
But we saw the flooding, and we're seeing it now in the Carolinas. So,
and I wonder if 100-year flood
it's no longer
is really the right marker. We've had the third 1,000-year flood in the country this year.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
So we had 3 instances where our main arterial street, Washington Street, was flooded at the Riverdale Mills for a couple of hours. Now, it was a tidal event, so the tide came up and went down. But for a couple of hours, 3 times, it was impassable to vehicles. So,
so a fire truck couldn't get
Exactly. So our fire department has now had to think through what happens when that happens, because it's not if it happens. It's now happened 3 times. So if they have an emergency call and they know that there's water over the road, they got to go a different way, and so they've got to plan for that.
Yeah.
Or we have to call Rockport and see if they're not busy.
They can come. Yeah, that's right.
Which they
not
probably
busy.
Which they might be.
Rockport has its own flooding issues.
Catherine mentioned, there's all there's lots of items like that. Like having the ham radio group is
it's actually
very
it's a real bonus to us.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I wanted to talk about in relationship to flooding events is how are the communities, how is Gloucester and neighborhoods looking at community connection plans, making sure that that they know where elders are living, and the most vulnerable populations. Is there kind of a neighborhood plan in place that gets triggered when an event like this happens, so that you know where to go and check on folks? Because it didn't happen in the Carolinas, and there are a lot of elders who are in a difficult situation right now, whether their house is flooded and they haven't been rescued. And so I think about that.
When we get robocalled when there's an event, the mayor always says, "Look in on the seniors in your neighborhood."
Right. I like
But
to
that's
see
not a
it.
formal
That's
plan,
not a formal
but-
plan to
but-
check on the most vulnerable to
I
make
think
sure that
there's
they're
a
okay.
few neighborhoods that have actually sort of established that. I think maybe in Annisquam or maybe in Magnolia, they have sort of established this informal neighbor to neighbor. There was, and I don't know if it's still active, the Community Emergency Response Team, which was run through a grant program through the emergency management position, where they were getting volunteers and training volunteers to be that neighbor-to-neighbor response, and that they would either be contacted through, the emergency response system, but I don't know if that's continued or how formal it's been.
It needs to be revived, and you're right. There are some ad hoc neighborhood groups that do just what you've described, Maureen, and it's something that we really need to ramp up, because it's something that rose up in some communities, but we need to provide them with a template on how to do it in all the communities.
Yeah, and it's really a very, in remote parts of the country where you are not going to be able to count on emergency response teams, they have very well developed systems of neighbor to neighbor. So it's we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Correct.
But,
No, and I think this is a great community for that. It's one of the things in the 20 years I've lived here, I've always felt that way, that the community really looks out for each other. So there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of informal. I mean, I know in my neighborhood people watch out, and if there were an event, we'd check in on people that we knew might need some help.
Yeah, it's something that we do.
We do instinctively
We do
here.
instinctively, yeah. But I'm looking at a plan. We do need to
Right.
have those community-based, neighborhood-based, or street-based plans, not necessarily an entire neighborhood.
right, particularly for, as you said, those vulnerable populations. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a 92-year-old woman who lives next to me. I keep an eye on her, but in an emergency, I would check on her. But if I wasn't there, would
you were
somebody
out of
else?
town, yeah.
Would somebody else know?
Right.
To check on her. And we just have a minute left in the show, and I wanted to touch on Paul's issue of volunteers. And I'm sorry we only have a minute, but volunteers in the city, and just briefly, if the three of you could touch on that quickly. And Paul, what did you want to?
There was a great lead-in for the volunteering on checking on the elders. The city of Gloucester has 30 boards and commissions, ranging from the Zoning Board of Appeals and the Planning Board down to the Animal Advisory Committee and everything in between, and the Cemetery Advisory Committee. They're all staffed by citizen volunteers, and we couldn't run the city without them. And so it's something that we want to make sure people know about, and we want to encourage people to find out about and join in.
Yeah, I think a big part of what makes the city work are these volunteer boards, and I think of myself as reasonably aware of what's going on. And I had no idea the number was 30. I knew it wasn't just the city council and the school committee, but I would have guessed a lot smaller number if you'd asked me.
Yeah, and I can only say that having served on a couple of different of the city boards and commissions, that it is a really enriching experience. You meet a lot of great, varied people. You learn a lot about the city that you had never really knew before, and it's a great. These boards really need we have a lot of talented people here, and so to get those talents and to have people offer those talents is really very valuable.
Yeah, and it's fun.
And it's fun. It's a lot of fun.
It's fun. Well, Paul Lundberg, Catherine Schlichte, and Peter Dolan, thank you so much for joining me on Cape Ann Report. I hope that you'll tune in next time. In the meantime, take care.